One of the things we do, though, to figure out what's going in a pond before we decide what actions to take, generally, is if you get a new pond that's already been established, or you've had a pond for a while and you wanted to change objectives, is to get some type of fish survey or some type of fish data. And I have our biologist, some other biologists out there now on the boat. They'll come back in a few minutes. They're collecting a fish sample. So that's the best way to do it. They can be pricey because you're going to have to get a private company to come in. But if you have a smaller pond, this one's hard to get a lot of data on if you're trying to use fishing, so you'd want like a survey on this. And hopefully you have enough landowners where you can put together and kind of put in for a survey with a private company, and they would do, we're just doing a small little shoreline site, but they would take a whole day or two through here and do multiple shoreline sites to get a stratified random sample of fish, and then go through them, weigh them and measure them and look at the different species, and then they can tell you what's going on. And then that's when you go into your objective phase of fish management, what you want to do with the fishery there. So, but we're just going to show you a little bit of what you can collect with a fish survey today. We're not going to have a whole big sample. But in a smaller pond, you can actually get that data from fishing. So I recommend, if you have a pond and you're really interested in fish management, to keep a journal at your pond. Anybody who comes there fishing, make sure get them to write down what they caught that day and if they're harvesting any fish. And that data can be really, really helpful in managing your pond in the future, and you wouldn't have to pay for a fish survey or something like that. So, but like I said, getting back to pond management after the fish survey, it's really about objectives and what you want. And what you can sustain in your pond. And in ponds in this part of Virginia, you're probably not going to have trout year round. So that's something you probably can't do. That's going to be more of a colder climate where you can do that. So you have to have, objectives that you can actually reach. So here in this area and kind of central and southeastern Virginia, you're talking about more warm water fisheries like our bass, catfish, bluegill, those type of things. And they're fairly easy to manage as far as you generally just stock them once, except for the catfish, and then they'll kind of do their own thing and you just monitor. And then you might have to do some harvesting, but it's just appropriate to kind of control what's going in and out of the pond as far as who's stocking the fish, what numbers you're stocking, and to monitor those a little bit. But once you get them established, you generally don't have to restock them unless there's something going on or you're trying to meet some higher objectives. And when I talk about those higher objectives, I'm talking about a lot of people are into trophy bass management now, where they're trying to grow big bass in ponds. And those, you have to do a lot more work with the pond to get there. You're having to stock fish more regularly. You're having to harvest bass out more regularly to get to higher growth rates, because these ponds can produce so many fish. So a lot of those people that are trying to get those big bass are kind of artificially managing the pond by keeping the reproduction really low and leaving the bass in there to have real heavy, fast growth rates. So they're getting big fast, but you don't have a huge population of them. So, but there's all different things you can do. You can manage your pond for bass bluegill. You can manage it for bass bluegill catfish. You can manage it for just catfish or just bluegill. There's a lot of different things you can do. What most people do around this part of Virginia is they just stock bass bluegill one time, leave them in there, and maybe some catfish every so often, and just kind of let it go in itself. So, and that's perfectly fine for a farm pond around here, especially if you just have a little bit of fishing. You just want, some friends or relatives to come out and catch fish every once in a while. That's perfectly fine. So here they just showing y'all, this is the boat coming back. So the way we collect fish in these surveys is we have something called an electro fishing boat, which is an aluminum boat with a generator in it, and we have specialized equipment from different companies. It's a pulse box, so it takes the power from the generator and amplifies it and turns it into direct current. So it's a different type of a pulse or it's actually pulsed, that the fish get, so it's safer on the fish, so they can actually catch the fish, put them in the boat, measure them, weigh them, and then throw them back when they're done. So I think they're coming over here now.
Can we ask a question?
Yeah, anytime.
I have a question.
So
You had mentioned that you don't need to restock the bass and the bluegill, but you alluded to
Yeah, so you will, generally in small ponds, catfish do not reproduce. So we did some studies and found if anything's below, it's generally around 400 acres. They don't, this is in general. Every once in a while you have a small pond where you can put them in and they reproduce like crazy, or a bigger pond like this, you know, something that's 100 acres, you might get some reproduction. But generally found if it's under about 400 acres, that you're not going to get natural reproduction. And it's just kind of that size. You might have a pond that's 401 acres and you put catfish in there and they still don't reproduce. But it's just, that's kind of general what we found. And what it is we think they're cavity spawners. So they have to get in boxes or nest inside the bank to spawn. And you can put boxes in your ponds to try and encourage that. The problem is a lot of the smaller ponds, they're just so congregated with the bass that when they hatch out of those boxes and they come out, the males try and protect them, but the bass just eat them up, is what we think. So generally, if you're stocking or want catfish in there, you're going to stock them because you're probably not going to get a lot of harvest in it. We stock our lakes every year, but that's because we get a lot of harvest from the general public because they're public waters. But on a private lake, you're probably only stocking anywhere between 5 to 10 years. So. And
good fish to have in a small pond.
they can be. It's just all about your preference, really. So some people like them because they like to catch them. They're easy to catch. They can feed them, so they can throw like dog food or fish food out, and they'll come up and they're easily trained to feed. So you can do that. So some people just like to have them. There's no, you know, they're not. Some people think, oh, well, they'll clean up the bottom of the lake. They're really not going to do that. They're just going to fill a little ecological niche. So, but you, like I said, you do have to continually stock them if you want to keep them in there for a long term. So, but, oh, go ahead.
Is there a size of pond that won't maintain fish? Not related to our pond. I'm just curious. Like, if you had a small pond, could it maintain bluegill and bass?
It generally can. Your biggest issue or obstacles with maintaining fish in small ponds are oxygen and vegetation issues, and that gets back to the oxygen too. But in smaller ponds, you have a more likelihood of depleting oxygen in the summertime when you have those really cloudy days for a long period of time, especially if you have a lot of vegetation, because during that time they're not producing oxygen, they're going through respiration where the plants are actually sucking in oxygen. So then you have this oxygen depletion in the lake, and that can kill the fish. Another thing you get in the smaller ponds more often is you can get them to stratify. Well, you get this in bigger ponds too, but so in the summer months, the hotter water stays up top and the colder water sinks. And the colder water will be below the photic zone, so there's no light getting down there, so there's no real activity as far as plankton growth or anything, so there's no oxygen getting put back in the water. And actually you have all that stuff that's floating or sinking down from the top layers that's breaking down, and that's sucking oxygen out of the water. So those cooler lower levels actually get the oxygen sucked out. And then what will happen, sometimes you get a big rain that comes in summer, one of those big summertime storms, and it will, the water will be colder and it'll flush that pond and flip it over real quick. So that colder water will push the cold water that's at the bottom pond and flip it up to the top, and so all that unoxygenated water comes up to the top and kills the fish that's up at that level. So the way you combat that though is you can install in those small ponds an aeration system, which I would recommend, especially if you've had fish kill issues before. So if you haven't had any fish kill issues, then it's probably not necessary. But you can be playing with fire if you're, especially in, those things that are under an acre, under about 5 acres to smaller, you can be playing with fire for fish kills to come, especially if you get a really dry, hot summer and then you get a whole bunch of rain. So you can also get seasonal turnover too, like when the temperature starts dropping. So, and aeration systems now are, they're not as costly as they used to be. They're fairly easy to install, and you can get solar panels if you have good access to run them. But the thing with aeration systems, it's good to have branches off of them, not just one. So they come off the bank, and they're just pretty much like little tubes that go out. They pump air out from a pump on the bank out to these heads that kind of aerate the gas coming out, and kind of bubbles it up in these real fine bubbles from the bottom. But some people put one in, or they'll put like a fountain in a pond, and a fountain's not doing all that much work because it's just at that one spot. So if you put an aeration system, I would recommend branching it off and doing multiple heads out there so you can get more oxygen throughout the lake. Another good thing about aeration systems is they'll help break down some of that bacteria near the bottom, so you don't get as much muck building up on the bottom of the ponds. So they can be a benefit to small ponds. It depends on the size of the pond, how much you're doing. I think you could get a small one at one time, and I hate to theorize now with after COVID with prices going way up, but I think you get a whole system at one time for like between $1,500 and $2,000 for a small pond. So, but the other thing with fish management, and this is going to go hand in hand with what you talk about later, is habitat. So that's one of the biggest things. It's what's going to keep your fish in your pond and get good numbers. Is having just the right amount of habitat. Vegetation is good to a point, but when it takes over, you're looking at anywhere above 20-30% of your pond. If you start getting more than that, then you start having issues with, you can have issues with fish kills, and the mat's getting so dense that fish can't even survive in there. And if those mats get farther out from the bank, the closer you get to the bank, those plants in there make it anoxic, the less oxygen, because when they're breaking down, the stuff that's dying, like I said, it's sucking out that oxygen. So the fish really can't go back way up in there unless you have a certain type of fish like mosquito fish, which are little small fish that most people aren't stocking in their ponds. So, but they can survive in low oxygen. But your bass and bluegill are kind of going to push out of those areas because they can't take that low oxygen level. But some stuff is good, but we can go down here and look at the fish if y'all want to now, see what you show, and then I can talk about the fish and the different things. I keep talking about bass, bluegill, catfish. Some of y'all might not know what those are. So I wanted to show you the fish too. And then we can probably have a more back and forth conversation about what y'all are looking to do in your ponds or what you think you want to do, and I can give you more advice on that. When we're looking at these small ponds in this part of Virginia, I was talking about, you mostly see bass bluegill dominated ponds. So in bass bluegill are predator prey type pond setup. So the bluegill are smaller prey items that are that actually eat the phytoplankton that are produced in the lake. That's your primary production for fish. That phytoplankton and zooplankton. The fish eat that. The bluegills and the minnows will eat that in the lake if you have minnows in here. And then the bass will eat those bluegill, and that's how they get big. So you want to look at the structure of both your prey populations and your predator populations to make sure you have the right dynamics for what you're trying to achieve with your objectives in the lake. For the longest time, they were talking, for fish management, they talked about balance ponds. I don't know if y'all have heard that before, like fish balance. And that was kind of a balance between the predator and prey dynamics and good sizes of each thing. Now, a lot of people are doing these ponds, like I said, up there, the trophy bass management. They're looking for different objectives. So they're doing different things. And those ponds are kind of out of balance, but they're actively managed that way. Most people, if they're just looking at a general pond and want to just throw fish in and just have a nice pond, they're looking more for like balance of fisheries, that old dynamic of a balanced fishery with the bass bluegill. So, and like I said, these are more warm water, so you're going to get those warm water fish, the bass bluegill. You could do something in a lake like this. This is kind of big, but a smaller lake, you can do a seasonal trout fishery like in the wintertime where you put trout in there and put feeders out and grow them really fast. And they're really great for kids to come over, grandkids or kids you bring over, family, friends, to catch trout during the winter and have something to do because they're active in the winter too. but they're going to die out in the summer. So that's just a real seasonal thing, and it's going to take maintenance every year to continue that program. So you can do some different things like that, but it's not what people typically do. But so let's go ahead and scoop some of the fish out.
You got some big bass.
Yeah, so give me a little big bass.
Little bass here.
So I'll give you a little bass first. So, and y'all will see how this is a lot more more effective than sampling with fishing line. But so when I talk about predators, these are typically the ones we have in here in impoundments. These are baby largemouth bass. So they're a type of sunfish species. They have a double dorsal fin, a spiky front, and a more rounded soft rayed one. You can see where they get the name largemouth bass because they have a big mouth relative to their body, and that's how they eat. You know, they're predators. They eat other fish. When they're really small, they will eat some zooplankton, but once they get to about this size, they're primarily going to be predators on other fish. And these, in the southeast of Virginia, this is probably the most fished freshwater fish area. So it's a very popular sport fish. That's why people like to put them in ponds. They're easy to catch. They grow fairly big. They'll get up to, in Virginia, they usually top out around 7 to 8 pounds. You can still get, some people still get them over 10 pounds in some places, but that's more rare than it is down south. So, but these are small ones. And what we like to see when we go to a pond like this, so a bass, they're kind of longer and skinny, but you want to see them more shaped like a football when you catch them, because that shows that they have some weight on them. They're a little healthier. This one's, you know, getting to be football shaped, so I would say this one's fairly healthy for its age. If you get, one thing we see problems with small ponds and lakes is you get a stunting of these guys because they just produce really good and they start eating their prey out, and nobody's harvesting them. So you'll start getting a bunch of smaller ones that are really, they got sunken in bellies, are really skinny. When you're out fishing, all you're catching are these small 8 to 10 inch bass and you never catch any bigger ones. It's generally an issue where the ponds got stunted and those fish are stockpiling in that size range because there's just not enough food for them to grow faster. So a lot of people think that, oh, I just got to leave them in there longer. They're just not old enough yet. Well, sometimes that's not the case. It's because of that stunting mechanism. And you can have a fish that small that's 10 years old and it's never going to get any bigger. So I tell people with bass and bluegill ponds, if you want to keep a balance and healthy population and grow some bigger bass, you probably want to have some harvest of bass out of that pond every year. There was an old adage back when people used to subsistence fish a lot more and they used to keep all the bass they used to catch. There was the whole catch and release movement, and that really helped improve fisheries, but it kind of went overboard to a point now where people will not keep bass because they think they're important to throw them all back. That's not the case now. So it's good to have some harvest of fish in your pond if you want to keep it healthy and balanced. So, and what we look at in a survey is we'll look at these bass, we'll look at the numbers of bass we collect, we look at the size range, make sure there's a variable size range, you're getting multiple size classes of fish, and then we'll do the same thing for the bluegill population or the sunfish, the prey population. I just say bluegill because that's probably what's in here. But so we know we have some little bass in here. So I'm pretending this is a whole survey and we've measured these fish and stuff and we're looking at data, but we're looking at the fish we're seeing as represented as our data. So we know we have small size classes of bass, younger, so there's reproduction going on, which is a good thing. Now what else do we have? So, now forage species, what I was talking about, the prey, these are kind of big ones. So it's going to look the opposite, but these are a prey species. This one's got a wound right here. This is called a bluegill. They're also in the sunfish family. They both have a double dorsal fin, but it's hard to tell. But they have the spiky rayed one up front and the soft rayed one right here. It's not disconnected like the bass is, but they're more round shaped, kind of like a pie plate. They get the name bluegill because they're under here. They'll get really blue in the summertime, and As you can see, they got a little tiny mouth compared to the bass in their body. These guys, like I said, are primarily eating plankton and small insects that are getting nutrients from the zooplankton and stuff. And these are what typically the bass is eating. Now those little ones like that, they're not going to be able to eat one this size. So that's why I'm saying it's important that you see a different size range of bluegill so you know there's plenty of food. If you get in a pond where you get a bunch of small bass and just all really big bluegill, this isn't super big, but you know, like that fish there, which is another type I'll talk about in a minute. But if you're seeing all big fish like these and then little small bass, that's generally another indication that you have stockpiling and crowding, because the bluegill that have made it through and can't get preyed on can grow big because they got plenty of food. But there's no small ones because the bass are picking them off as fast as they come off the beds. So this is another bluegill. And when I said blue, you can see how this one has the blue coloration. One way you can tell the bluegill from the other sunfish that look like this, and I'll show you in the red here in a minute. Red ear here. This back soft rayed dorsal fin, you can see this black spot right here. The bluegill will always have a black spot right there. So this is probably a male that's starting to get colored up. The males will get really dark in color. This is a mature, nice size adult. They can get a lot bigger than this, but generally in ponds around here, this is about their natural kind of top end size, unless you're feeding them to try and increase that growth rate. So now this one is another fish species. That's another sunfish that these can be prey for bass too. These have a little bit bigger mouth than the bluegill. These are called red ear sunfish. They get that name because that coloration right here. Some people call them shell crackers. They get the name shell crackers because they'll eat small snails and stuff at the bottom. So people call them shell crackers because they're cracking the shells of those fish. These are sometimes good to have in the ponds because they actually break. There's a cycle of a parasite that goes in the fish and gets in their flesh. It's not harmful to humans, but it looks kind of nasty. When you're filleting fish, if you like to eat fish, you'll see these little worms in there. But their life cycles they go through birds and then snails and then in the fish. And if you have these in here, then they'll eat the snails sometimes and can help break that life cycle so you won't get those worms in your pond as easily. So they're nice to have. They can grow a little bit bigger than the bluegill. It's a red ear or shell cracker. If you see back here, it's hard to tell. There's some mottling back here, but you don't see that really dark black spot right there like you did on the bluegill. So, because not all of them will have this really distinct, it might be a little opaque looking, or sometimes they're not even colored up at all. So sometimes you have to look at the fin to tell if it's a red ear versus a bluegill. But they can grow a little bit bigger than the bluegill. Sometimes they have faster rates. They're generally not as hardy or do as well in the ponds as a bluegill, but I mean they'll do fine around here, but they're not as good at reproduction as the bluegill are in these small ponds. So we saw kind of our bluegill and red ear. We got some nice big red ears and bluegill. We haven't seen any small ones yet. Did y'all get some smaller ones, or did y'all just not collect them?
No, that was all the red. There's one more in here.
But were y'all seeing smaller bluegill and stuff? Yeah. Okay. So they were seeing them. They just didn't collect them because they're harder to deal with in these nets and stuff. But they were seeing the different size ranges of bluegill in here. So that looks good so far. Now, the only other thing we want to know is where y'all getting different size ranges of bass. So, okay.
I don't know if you want those or you want to give us, we've got.
What's that?
We've got one copy of those.
Okay, yeah. Yeah.
You want us to put one in the bucket?
Oh, yeah. So this is another species of sunfish. This is called a black crappie. And these guys, some people call them freckles because they have the spots. But they'll have a bigger mouth too. Some people call them paper mouths because their mouth's so thin, the stuff in here. These can be problematic in small ponds. One this size, it's fine. But these guys in small farm ponds, they're so hard to manage, and you can have, they do 10 different things in 10 different ponds. But a lot of times, the majority of things they do in the small ponds is they stun out really fast. They have good reproduction. And this was a nice size one. They're really good to eat, so people like to stock them in their ponds, in the small farm ponds and stuff. But a lot of times they'll stun out, and all you catch are little 6-inch crappie. And it's the same thing. They're just eating their food base out from under them, and they really can't. They stay small and they can't switch over the fish. This one can switch over to small fish because it's got a big enough mouth, so it can grow fast enough and to get some weight on it. When they're just eating invertebrates and zooplankton all the time, they really don't grow fast, and that's generally what happens in small ponds. So we don't really recommend stocking them in ponds under probably 50 acres in Virginia, just because of that issue.
How do you spell it? Is it crappie or crappie?
It depends on where you live. But it's C-R-A-P-P-I-E.
Okay.
Are they also called silvers?
Some people call them silvers, yeah.
Okay. And,
So.
But I also think that many people call them trash fish.
They
want them out of their pond.
Yeah, some people know that about ponds, and they will take them out because people will stock them in there. You know, oftentimes people will get stuff in their pond and be like, oh, the birds must have brought it. A lot of times somebody brought it. It's not the birds. So it's somebody that's either snuck in or whatever. But some people love to have these in ponds because they love to eat them because they taste really good. They're really white fish that's really mild flavored, so they're not going to have a strong fishy flavor.
They're also fun to catch.
Yeah, and they're fun to catch because when you have a good population like this size, that'd be really fun to catch. And you catch them in aggregate, so you can find some place where they're out certain times of year, and you can catch 25, 30 in an hour. So they're really fun to catch. So, but oftentimes, if you have a small pond and you didn't stock crappie and then they show up, somebody probably snuck in and threw them in, or somebody that you gave permission threw them in because they wanted them in there because they thought they were fun. And then every once in a while they do fine in small ponds, and you get some nice big ones. You're not going to have tons of them, but you get some nice big ones. But in most instances, we see the opposite. We see where they stun out and they just don't get very big. So we recommend, even if you go on our fish management section of our webpage, and most states recommend not stocking them. Now they are working on sterile ones, like a hybrid sterile, some of these hatcheries, and they're selling them now. We haven't had much experience with them, so I can't verify whether or not I think that they'll do good in ponds, just because we haven't stocked them anywhere and we haven't seen any success. I'm gonna put him back. So, but there might be that option coming down. The one thing I will tell you about buying fish from fish farms and stuff, oftentimes, they have good products and they're doing that, but they're also trying to sell stuff. So sometimes they'll guarantee stuff about, well, this fish won't reproduce in your pond, or this will do what you want. You should really check with a biologist too, or people who've had experience with it, because sometimes they're selling stuff that they think might work, but it's not necessarily going to be the best biological thing to put in your pond. And that's the thing with the crappie. They're starting to produce those, and they're supposed to be hybrids that can be functionally sterile because of the hybridization process, but not all hybrids are sterile. So we don't know what's going to happen with that and what success they're having. I think some states are starting to stock them and see, but we don't have that track record to know yet. So now this is another fish we got in this pond, which is actually a native catfish. So this probably just came out of the stream and in the drainage. These are brown bullheads. So these are one of our native catfish. These were here before people were.
Are they also in the James River?
They are in the James River in certain areas. We also have another one that's in the same kind of family as this, or same genus as this. It's a white catfish. That was a native catfish we had. All the catfish that people think of now in Virginia, like the channel catfish, the flatheads, the blue catfish, none of those are actually native to Virginia, except in the far southwest section in the kind of Ohio drainage waters. So, and those things over here are non-native. Now, they consider them naturalized because they've been here so long. We don't consider them invasive to cause problems. Well, most of them anyway. Like the channel catfish for the ponds, we we don't consider those invasive. You know, if people stock them, we're perfectly fine with that, and they do a great job. We did have a regulation where you can't stock blue catfish in private ponds anymore, because we were worried about people stocking them and them those getting out to the streams and rivers, because we do have them in the tidal rivers now, and we just didn't want them expanding across the state, because they've known to be a little bit more problematic than the channel catfish and the other catfish. But this is a native one. One of the ways you can tell the bullheads, they get these great big heads. That's where they get the name bullhead. I thought you were reaching in my pocket, Robbie. Oh. The brown bullheads kind of had this mottled color, and they'll have these brown whiskers on the bottom of their chin. There's another one called a yellow bullhead that looks similar, but their chin barbels will be all yellow or white looking. But just so you know, catfish, they have 3 spikes. They can stick you, and they're serrated on the back end, on their pectoral fins and on their dorsal fin. So you just kind of got to watch it to hold them. These bigger catfish, people think that the whiskers sting. There's the old myth. They don't sting. These are sensory things. They have taste buds in them. That's how catfish can find food, all on the bottom. When you throw out night crawlers or something, they swim around and they can taste with these, and they have some taste buds in their skin too. So, but these are the things you have to worry about, just poking you on the end, and then they're serrated, kind of like a Ginsu knife on the backside. So you have to be careful. But you know, they're not bad. The bullheads will have, if you look at their tail, they have more of a rounded tail versus some of the other catfish that have more forked tails. But this is a nice size bullhead. They don't get too much bigger than this. So.
This is a fish fry for lunch today.
Yeah. So these are kind of a neat special to see in the lake. That's another brown bullhead. He's a little bit different coloration because he's smaller. So, but you still see the mottled and the brown barbels. So.
Are there any of the fish that you've shown us so far that aren't native?
So, the bass and bluegill are technically not native to this area of Virginia. They've been here so long, they're considered naturalized, and people think they're native. The bass we think are only native to kind of the far southeast of Virginia, kind of down like Back Bay area and stuff. But they've been part of the American culture for so long that people just think they're a native fish everywhere. Same thing with the bluegill. I will tell you, fisheries management, the old days of fish management, was a kind of Johnny Appleseed approach. Before they really knew what they were doing, they were just throwing fish everywhere. They would put them on trains and drop them off on bridges and stuff. They're like, if this fish is good here, it's got to be good everywhere. And they were doing that with everything. So there's a lot of stuff that got put around in America back in the early 20th century, where they were just moving fish all around everywhere. So a lot of the stuff you see, I shouldn't say a lot. Virginia is a very diverse state. We have over 240 species of freshwater fish. A lot of those are native natural fish, but most of them are stream and river fish, because that's our natural systems. We only have 2 natural lakes in Virginia. So those are our natural systems. That's where species have had the most time to evolve. And we have some neat characteristics in the mid-Atlantic region, where you had the glaciers didn't come this far down, and you had mixing of watersheds over, you know, millions of years, where you had Atlantic drainages that went to the Gulf drainage and back and forth. So you had all these like neat periods where you had all this speciation going on. So it's a really diverse thing. Ponds, since they were not one of our natural areas, except for like smaller like beaver ponds and stuff like that. A lot of the fish you see in there are ones that we brought into stock because we didn't have those natural systems here. So we brought them into stock to fill a niche. So that's why you got the bass, bluegill and stuff here now, because there's a lot more farm ponds and man-made ponds here now. So.
What are the 2 natural lakes?
Here's Lake Drummond, which is down on the coast, and that was a natural depression that when the seas receded, it held water in it, kind of like a lot of the Florida lakes are like that. They're not super deep, they're just big, and they're big natural bowls. The other one was a mountain lake up in Giles County, which I don't even know if it's a lake anymore, because it keeps, yeah.
How about Clater?
Clater, no, that's a man-made lake. So
Filled up from underground water.
that's Mountain Lake. That's the one in Giles County, and it was about, I think, between 100 and 200 acres. And that was created by natural landslide that filled in the valley and then it filled up with water, but there's some leak in it. Like every so often there's some seismic activity that changes things and then it'll start leaking out. Then something will happen and it will stop that leak and it will fill back up. But I think this cycle it's been on a drain for probably like 20 years now. So when I was in college, which seems like not that long ago, but it's been over 20 years, Mountain Lake was full, but now it's almost a puddle now. But I don't know if y'all have seen Dirty Dancing, but some of the scenes were filmed there for Dirty Dancing.
How do you define a pond versus a lake? I Google it and it's very confusing.
Yeah, there's no real definition. So they're both the same thing, used interchangeably. Generally, ponds are smaller. So generally people use the pond term for stuff that are smaller. We usually use ponds for, in our agency, for stuff under like 10 acres.
Okay.
But there's no real strict definition. So. It's kind of like stream and creek, or stream and river, so.
There's more.
More bigger ones?
No. There's some smaller ones and some down the back.
So these are what people like to catch. So they like bass. Generally anglers like to catch bass that are like 15 inches or bigger. That's what we consider a preferred size bass. This one's
Like an 8-pounder?
no. So this one's probably 3 pounds. So 8 pounders much. I mean, they get much bigger than this. 8 pounds is gonna.
Depends on who catches it.
Yeah. If I hold it out way out here like this. So it was 8 pound. Yeah, and then a lot of, when I caught a fish like the first fish I caught like this when I was a kid, I thought it was probably 8 pounds when I first caught it. I was like, this thing's huge. But so what you want to see is you want to see some of these bigger fish too. In a smaller pond, you're going to have less of them because there's not as much food. So in a pond like this size, if you got good production and stuff, and you can see here, this pond actually looks sort of green, which it's probably got a little bit of algae bloom on it, which is a good thing for fish production as long as it's not so productive that you're getting harmful algae blooms where you're getting a lot of cyanobacteria, which is a blue-green algae, which is natural to Virginia. The problem, and they're not all toxic, the problem is when they get in high numbers, they can get toxic, so you don't want a toxic algae bloom. But
That also causes a change in the taste of the fish, is that right?
Some people say it does.
Yeah, they did in the catfish. Wasn't that a problem in the catfish ponds in the south?
Yeah, it probably was. But we do that on a few of our lakes. We fertilize them because they're so unproductive. So, and that's another one of those active management things. Like if you're trying to really do fish production, that's something you can do with your pond too. But that goes back to your objectives of your pond. If you have a pond that's in a drainage, it's not getting much inflow of water or doesn't have much agriculture or stuff in the watershed where you're getting nutrients coming in, they can be kind of unproductive. And so that's where if you want to increase fish production, you would do a program where you're liming your lake and then you're fertilizing it every year during the growing season, just like they do on the farm fields and stuff. And that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to increase yield like you're on a field. And we do that in some of our ponds because we get, some of our lakes because we get so much more pressure and a lot more people fishing. Generally in a private pond, unless you're really trying to actively manage and do something like trophy bass management or trophy bluegill management, then you're not going to have to do something like that. So, and like this one, it's probably got enough agriculture in the watershed that you're getting some nutrients come down here and you're getting some blooms in here. But not all, I guess what I was trying to say about it, not all algae blooms are bad. They can be good and really beneficial for fish. And something like this, if you're seeing like a pea soup green color, that's generally a good algae bloom. So this is another bass, a decent size one. So when we're sampling something like this, you want to see a handful of bass this size or bigger. You want to see some in between those first ones, those little ones that I showed you. And then you want to see some of those little ones. So you want to see just the different size ranges of fish. So now they only sampled for like 5 or 10 minutes. So, and they weren't collecting everything, so we didn't get all the fish, but I'm assuming they were seeing all those kind of size ranges in there. Oh, you got more?
Yeah, we saw one grass carp.
So that's another thing you'll hear about, and you might get into that. So this is good size too, because this one's a little bit smaller than that one, but it probably fills in that, you know, some of those medium size ranges. So, but they're all, this time of year, if you see, they're a little bit skinny, but they just got out of the spawning season, so they probably lost a bunch of weight. Yeah, so this is another good medium size range. So they're not going to have that full football shape. Oh. But these guys, you know, when they're starting to lack food, when they, let's say they look like this, they have this head, and then their body is just barely thin, and they're really sunken in belly. That's when you start noticing some stunting and stuff. But these guys all look fairly healthy, especially coming out of the spawn. So.
I'm curious to know if you have found any carp.
Yeah, so he just said that they saw at least one grass carp.
Really? Okay.
So, and that's another thing if you have a pond. Our biggest, small pond, even lakes, our biggest call we get is not really about the fish, it's more about the vegetation and people worried about it. That's the biggest issues in ponds. Ponds naturally go through a cycle called eutrophication, where they're filling in. That's what ponds do, they fill in over time. But as they fill in, you're getting more of that, those shallow areas where you can get light penetration. And if you're if you have light penetration and any type of productivity, any type of nutrients coming in, you're going to get grass or something growing there eventually. It just takes a matter of time for some waterfowl brings in a seed from somewhere and you get something growing. The question is whether it's the vegetation you want or if it's a super aggressive one. There's native ones and non-native ones that are super aggressive and can take over a pond, and there's native and non-native ones that are slower growing and can do better in a pond. So, but that's probably our biggest question we get. And one of the things that people will do to help with some of the vegetation is stock something called triploid grass carp. It's not all carp. You don't want common carp. You don't want, they'll sell you something called Israeli carp, all these other things. You want triploid grass carp. Just grass carp. And triploid is T-R-I-O, no, T-R, yeah, sorry. I'm having a hard time spelling. But they are fish that are produced at these hatcheries that they pressure treat the eggs so they get an extra chromosome. And they're functionally sterile. So some of them can still produce eggs, and some of the males can still produce milk, but they're like messed up eggs. They're not gonna reproduce in there. And the reason we do that is because we don't want a carp species that can populate the rivers and stuff like you see out in the Midwest with the silver carp and stuff. And there's a potential for grass carp to do that too. But so we only let the sterile ones come in, and they have to produce them at hatchery, and they cost more money because it's a longer production process and more intense production process than just hatching out some eggs and letting them grow. So I think they're anywhere between $10 and $15 a fish, and you get them about 12 to 15 inches when you stock them. I will tell you this, some of the suppliers and some people you talk to will act like grass carp are a magic bullet. They'll take care of any vegetation. They won't. There's a lot of vegetations they won't touch, and there's vegetations that they won't touch unless they're stocking so high numbers that they're going to wipe everything out of your pond. The other thing with grass carp is when they work great, but sometimes they work too much. We have stocking rates, but none of that those stocking rates are not set in stone. They're just based on experience. But one pond, you can go from stocking 5 fish an acre and not having any effect and say, I'm gonna bump it up to 10 fish an acre, do 10 fish an acre, and it wipes out your pond with all vegetation. So you kind of got to monitor it and see, and they're a long-term, if you have vegetation, established vegetation, they're a long-term thing. You have to do maintenance stockings every so often. So every 8 to 10 years, you want to put more in if you want to kind of control that vegetation. So
The grass carp eat grass.
yes,
Other than-
yeah. So,
But
and
they don't eat algae.
they will sometimes.
Because it was stocked with grass carp
Yeah,
in '89.
yeah. And a lot of those grass, was that the last time it was stocked? So they were seeing, was it a real big grass carp?
It's probably about 10, 12 pounds.
That's what
Yeah.
I was curious about.
So you would think they'd be bigger than that because they can get up to like 60 pounds, but that's a pretty old one. The other thing that's counterintuitive about grass carp is as they get older and bigger, they're less productive. You would think like 60-pound fish, oh, it's got to be eating a lot. No, when they're this size, they're the most productive. So when they get to full grown, they're only probably, I'm just guessing, probably about a quarter as productive as they're going to be at that growing size where they're really eating a lot of vegetation. So that's why you also have to continue stocking. And they have high mortality rates. So their mortality rates can be about 50% a year, where you're losing about 50%, especially when they're young. So
What's their
Productive
lifespan?
in shallow water.
what's that?
Are they productive in shallow water?
Yeah. So especially if you have vegetation, they'll work on that vegetation, shallow water. That's generally where you see them at, in the shallow areas, because they're in there trying to get some vegetation.
I've
So.
got a question about size too of
Yeah.
fish. I've always
didn't.
been told since
Yes.
childhood,
What we
somewhere
wanted.
along the line, that a plane went down. I lived near Bugs Island. Plane
Okay.
went down after they did the dam later,
Yeah.
and divers went down and said they'd never go back down there again. There were catfish big as them. Is that
Yeah.
possible?
So
Catfish as big as a woman?
I tell you, I've heard that story at every dam I've been to. So,
I thought so.
I mean, there are big catfish. The world record blue catfish came out of Bugs Island and it's 143 pounds.
Okay.
So if you saw a 143-pound fish under the water, it's probably going to look 300 pounds. So, I mean, they're big-looking fish. So it wouldn't surprise me, but you hear that at every lake. Yeah, there's all these folk legends about that stuff.
That's right.
So I've heard it at every lake in Virginia,
How long
Depends
can
on how many
they
beers
live?
you've had.
The grass carp will generally live, if they go out throughout their life cycle, they can live probably 15, 20 years. So they can live for a while.
Some in ours, 55 in
Yeah, I mean, she said they were 89, so they're still in there. So that's close to, that's more than 30 years.
What about eel?
Yes.
If you're catching eel in your pond,
So I would consider that a good thing.
okay.
American eel, we only have one species of eel in North America. It's an American eel, and they're a migratory species. So they live, or they spawn out in the Sargasso Sea in the southern Atlantic near the Caribbean. And then when they hatch out, they flow with the currents over to North America. And then when they get a certain size, they're free floating, so they can't swim against the current. They just go with the current. They go from all the way down from Florida all the way up to Nova Scotia. Once they get to a certain size, then they start swimming up the streams, and they'll go as far as they can go. Some of them go all the way up to the mountain trout streams in Virginia, and they'll stay there for 15 to 20 years until they're ready to go back and spawn in the Sargasso Sea. So they're a migratory species. That's neat to see. If you have them in your pond, it just shows that you have good migration route for them to get up in the pond, because they had to come over the dam somehow. So, and it just,
Everything floods.
yeah. So it wouldn't surprise me, but it's good to see. They're good to see in there because they're good migratory fish to have. So, and they're just going to sit there. If they're in the pond, they're just eating bugs and invertebrates like crayfish and stuff like that. They're not going to harm your fish population. So.
And if you have a lot of crayfish holes, that's also a good sign.
Yeah, because they're just food for the fish. So, and for the eels, which eels is a fish. But so I guess one thing I wanted to talk about too is, I've talked about a lot early on, sorry I keep messing with this microphone, about fisheries-based management in ponds is all about your objectives. So that's the biggest thing you want to figure out is, what do you want to do with your pond? Do you just want fish in there because you want it healthy and stock some fish? That's as easy as just following our stocking rates online, or any agency stocking rates that's in the southeast, stocking those fish and kind of letting them cycle and do their thing. These are all self-reproducing except for the catfish. So that's, like I said, that's just as easy as just stocking the fish and letting them do their thing. Now, if you want other stuff, there's different things. I talked about the trophy bass management. Another thing that people will do is fish feeding programs because they like to see the fish. You can do those with the bluegill and red ear. Supposedly there's there's feed trained bass. I don't know if I believe that as much, but supposedly you can stock those. I probably wouldn't recommend that. I would stick with just feeding the bluegill or the catfish. But that can be a neat program too, and you can get a solar panel feeder that shoots out feed a couple times a day. The biggest thing with that is you're gonna spend money on the feed every year, and you don't want to. If you did it one year, you kind of want to keep it up if you want to see those growth rates up with those fish. That's another way that you can supplement production in the lake without having to fertilize it. You can just do it by naturally throwing the feed in. Some people will manage ponds, like I said, for trophy bass, and what they're doing is they're getting the fish out of balance, so you're not seeing those small bass like we saw earlier. They're putting a bunch of food in there, so they're generally stocking prey every year, and then so the bass that stay, they have plenty to eat, and they have these phenomenal growth rates. I mean, they can grow an 8-pound bass in like 4 or 5 years in some of these places. But it's incredibly expensive. I don't know, I'm sure y'all know, The Rock, Dwayne The Rock Johnson. He has a lake up in, is it Orange County? It's up there, but it's a little small. It's probably only like 2 acres. He loves to fish. There's a private pond company that manages it for him. They come in and they do this real active management. You know, he's got plenty of money to spend. I think they told me one time they were spending about 20 grand a year just in bait fish to put in there so the bass could grow big. But that's what he wants. He wants to come there and throw out a line and catch a big bass. So he's paying for it, but he's getting it. So you can do things like that, but you know, sometimes it can be fairly pricey. So my biggest thing, or what I tell people, is if you just want a good pond, just stock bass, bluegill, catfish. If you want to see the fish, put a feeder out there. If it's a bigger pond, put a couple feeders out there. If you're having issues with fish kills, or you think you might have fish kills, go ahead and maybe look at getting an aeration system, but you don't necessarily need one. And then monitor what people are catching out of the lake. So it's always a good job. I tell people if you can put one, a bigger lake like this is a little bit harder because you have multiple access points, but if it's on your farm, on your property, you can just put a little mailbox out there and put a little journal in there and say, hey, you know, you're welcome to fish out here, but go ahead and make sure you fill out the journal with what you catch, and leave a little measuring stick in there or something. So, and then that can tell you as much as what's going on as some of these fish surveys. If you're getting good data and people are actually filling that book out. So,
Is there a rule of thumb for how much vegetation is a good balance?
we usually say anything over about 30% is starting to get iffy. So, yes.
Do you recommend stocking pond with, say, fathead minnows, other than when you're starting? Is it ever beneficial down the road?
It is if you're trying to do one of those trophy fish things, and you're really trying to. Generally, you'd switch over to a different type of shiner, like a golden shiner or something. But
how about the pink ones? Aren't they the fatheads?
Yeah, the fatheads. Yeah, they're a little bit smaller, not quite as hardy as the thing. They usually put them in when they're first starting a pond, just to give those smaller bass some fish to eat until they can switch over to the bluegills. But I don't recommend, unless you're really intensively trying to manage it and go for trophy bass or something like that, or want to do it. If you're going to start doing a supplemental program like that, you're going to want to do it every year. You're not going to want to increase their growth rate one year and then take the food out from under them the next year. So those can get pricey. Like I said, The Rock for a 2-acre pond was paying, you know, close to 20 grand for those small fish every year, those golden shiners and bluegills. So that's the thing. Also with the fertilization program, if you start a fertilization program or a stocking program where you're stocking bait, just know that if you stop that, you're taking out a good portion of the food source. So you're probably going to have some type of stockpiling. You're probably going to see bass that grew really fast and they got these great big heads and they don't have any body at all because their food source just dropped out from under them. So when you start something like that, you have to kind of keep it going if you want to keep those growth rates up on the bass. If you don't care about it, if you get tired of doing it and say, oh, it's fun for the bass for a while and take it out, you're just going to have stunted fish, but you're still going to have fish in there. So, and there's nothing necessarily unhealthy about your pond if it's out of balance due to stuff like that stunning. That stuff happens in nature and it just takes time for the stuff to cycle out, the predator-prey interactions. So if you're seeing fish in there and you're seeing good numbers of fish, no matter if they're stunted or not, that generally means you have a decent, your pond health is decent enough to produce fish. So that doesn't necessarily mean your pond's unhealthy, like for water quality reasons and stuff. So.
To keep on schedule,
Yeah, sorry about that.
we're gonna scoot on back to the pavilion.
And I have some, if y'all have any questions or I got some business cards and y'all can feel free to call me or if you're in a different area, I can get you contact for the biologist down there too. So I'll leave some at the table.
Yeah,
So.
and I made a Google Drive with a ton of resources that I didn't want to fill your packets with and use all our ink. But I'll share that with everybody that gave me their email so that you've got that resource. And I put a ton of DWR contacts and all that good stuff in there.
And I would tell you, we have a pond management guide that's on our website. It's not as robust as some of the states. I think Kentucky has a really good one. A lot of these states used to produce these really good private pond management guides, and we used to have a printed out pamphlet, but it got so expensive to do those things that some of them are gone away. Some states still have those and have really extensive ones. You just got to understand that if you're in a different state, then regulations might be different, so you have to watch the regulations. And some of the management might be different just because you're in a different zone. They might talk about fish or techniques that aren't applicable for here, but you can find some good ones in the other state agencies too. So, but concentrate kind of on the southeast, mid-Atlantic if you're looking at those. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank y'all.
Is Brim another name for?
Yeah, for bluegills.